Today we bring you the first of two programs with Neil Armstrong. In 1963, he was transferred to astronaut status. He served as command pilot for the Gemini 8 mission, launched March 16, 1966, and performed the first successful docking of two vehicles in space. In 1969, he was commander of Apollo 11, the first manned lunar landing mission, and gained the distinction of being the first man to land a craft on the moon, and the first man to step on its surface. This interview was conducted by Stephen Ambrose and Douglas Brinkley. It was recorded September 19, 2001 at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. It's been edited for this broadcast.
I just wanted to start a little bit about growing up in Ohio. And Ohio is an aviation state. And I read somewhere that you're very young and your father took you to the national air races in Cleveland. You were so young that you didn't even...
I was 2 the first time I went to the air races. And of course I have no recollection of that now.
Did your father have an interest in flight? Is that why he would take you there? Or was it just in the air at that time that was so exciting?
I don't think he had a particular interest in flight. It was just an opportunity to take children to new experiences, I guess.
And that you got to ride in your first plane when you were age 6, or in one of the Ford trimotors. And Warren, do you have recollections of that?
I do not.
You don't?
No.
When did you first hear of Lindbergh?
Oh, I'm sure as... I can't remember when the first time was, but I'm sure it was when I was schoolboy in elementary school.
And everybody in America knew.
But schoolboys talked about heroes of flight.
Did you later have an opportunity to meet Lindbergh, see somebody that was been in your mind as an aviation, when you were becoming a pilot, thinking about Lindbergh? Did he mean a great deal to you as an American icon?
I did have the opportunity to meet him on several occasions. I had enormous admiration for him as a pilot. I read some of his books. I was aware of the controversial position he took on certain issues, but I was very pleased to have had the chance to meet him, and I think his wife was a wonderful person and quite a delicate writer. Yes.
Did he give you did you ever correspond with him at the time of the Apollo? Was there any kind of wishing you well before the Apollo 11 mission, or something like a good, wishing you luck sort of?
I can't recall that. I think I had some letters from him in my file, though.
When did you begin building things? Your interest in your concern with engineering, your wanting to build things, is that a part of your memory from when you were 5 or 6 years old? Did you have a special bent towards that?
I began to focus on aviation probably at age 8 or 9. And inspired by what I'd read and seen about aviation and the building of model aircraft, why I determined at an early age, and I don't know exactly what age, but while I was still in elementary school, that was the field I wanted to go into, although my intention was to be, or hoped was to be, an aircraft designer. And I later went into piloting because I thought a good designer ought to know the operational aspects of an airplane.
Were you good in mathematics?
Everything's relative. I was good in my small classes. However, I've since met many people who have far better mastery of mathematics than I will ever have.
You were, what, a sophomore in high school when World War II ended?
That's approximately, let's see, 47. Yeah, I was between my sophomore and junior year.
And the assumption among young men at that time was, as soon as I graduate or as soon as I get to be 18, I'm going into the service. But then the war ended when you were 15.
Mm-hmm.
So you completed the high school without any, I'm going to enlist kind of feeling.
That's correct. We had a few people in my school who had either lied about their age or were a little bit older than our class, who had gone into the service and came back and finished high school after the war was over. And we had several of those fellows in our school. But the youngest of those would probably be 2 years older than I was.
Yeah. A Navy scholarship to Purdue immediately after graduating high school, I gather.
I believe that the tests for what was called the Holloway Plan, the Naval Aviation College program, were administered nationwide while I was still in high school, probably shortly before graduation, although I cannot remember the precise date. It was early enough so that we could pick a school. If we were accepted into this program, we could pick any accredited school in the nation to.
Was the test on one of those IBM sheets where you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you have a lead pencil and you?
I don't think so. I believe it was predominantly. I shouldn't really say because I could confuse that, but my recollection is that it was a pen and pencil or a pencil and paper exam with a variety of different kinds of questions and sections.
Mainly mathematics or mathematics and physics?
I'm sure they had a focus on things that would be appropriate to aviation because of an aviation-directed program, but I can't remember the details of the test, except that I recall it was quite long.
What do you mean by all day?
Yeah, it was an all-day test.
That's the way they used to do it, I know. I've been through that myself. So you came out well, obviously, and the Navy offered you on the Holly plan, it was like Naval ROTC, that you would get tuition and a stipend of $25 a month or something like that, I suppose.
Unfortunately, it was a little more than that. They would pay tuition fees and books.
Yeah.
Plus let's see, this type in. They paid nothing while we were in school, but when we went to active duty, then they paid $75 a month.
So when you accepted in this program, you were signing up, in effect. And you were subject to call from the Navy.
7-year program, yes. 2 years of active duty, then go to the Navy, go through flight training, get a commission, and then serve in the regular Navy for a total then of 3 years of active duty, after which the plan would be to return to university and finish the last 2 years. And the intent of this program, named after Admiral Holloway, who if memory serves, was Wally Schirr's father-in-law. And the intent was to build up the Naval Air Reserve strength, which they felt was going downhill because people after the war didn't really want to do that stuff anymore. That was my understanding at the time.
So you were called up for flight training after, 1 year at Purdue or 2 years?
A year and a half.
A year and a half?
Mm-hmm. It was supposed to be 2 years, but they
So that was...
I suppose they saw Korea coming or something,
Yeah.
and they needed to ratchet the volume up a little bit, so they called us in early.
When did you get your wings in commission? What was the date?
I got my wings in August of 1950, and but that was about 17 or 18 months after I'd begun my active duty service. So I still had another 6 months to go. So I was one of those rare birds, a midshipman with wings, and so I was went to the fleet squadron, was in a standby unit for a while, and then assigned to a jet fighter squadron, still as a midshipman, making $75 a month plus flight pay. 50% of $75.
Was landing landing on carriers at night? I mean, that was extraordinarily difficult to learn. Is there one aspect of this period where it was a hard thing for you to conquer? Something like that?
I happened to be a day fighter pilot. We had night fighter pilots on the ship I was on, and I thought they were crazy.
Did you ever have to do a night landing?
I did it only in practice. I never did it on a carrier. All my landings on a carrier were in day. I was always happy about that.
So August of 50, and the Korean War is now a couple of months old.
Yeah, it just started.
Yeah. And you're completing your basic, and did they send you right off?
I asked for the Pacific Fleet, and what was given the Pacific Fleet. But as I say, I was first sent out to a squadron called FASRON, Fleet Air Service Squadron, which is a utility squadron that handled all kinds of miscellaneous jobs that needed to be done around a large naval air station. And that sort of was a holding position. They would typically take new entrants that come to that base and stick them there for a time period until there was a squadron opening for them for assignment. And so I was in that squadron for probably 3 or 4 months until there was an opening for me in Fighter Squadron 51.
And that would have been at the end of 1950.
That was the end of 50. November or December, as I remember.
And then off to the fleet.
Yeah, we immediately prepared to be assigned to the Korean action, and so it was a matter of the squadron training everyone in an operational sense to do the job that they would be expected to do. So that period, again, you sort of do the same sorts of things as you did in training. Now you're in a new aircraft, but you have a much more specific objective because you sort of know what kind of environment you're going into. We didn't know to what extent we would be offensive, in the sense that we would be dropping bombs or shooting guns, or to what extent we might be defending the fleet against Chinese or Russian incoming aircraft, to what extent it might be air-to-air or air-to-ground. So we had to prepare for sort of all of those, plus becoming carrier qualified in the jet aircraft and doing a lot of practice with weapons delivery, instrument flying, and so on. The things that we would be facing when we got in operation. Yeah, I was very young, very green.
In this period, the notion of space in the 50s is starting to be talked about. NASA, especially now NASA, under Eisenhower administrations. Do you have any thoughts on some of the early events of the space race, such as the launch of Sputnik? Do you remember your feeling of hearing about Sputnik and, Explorer 1? Were you conscious of the politics of the Cold War going on with the race into space at that time when you were at Edwards?
Well, before it was Dryden, before it was Flight Research Center, it was called NACA High Speed Flight Station. And they were working on the problems of high-speed, high-altitude flight. And they were looking ahead to days when we would fly hypersonically and high hypersonically and eventually even further, and looking to solve all the problems along the way that would allow that to happen. It wasn't something we talked a lot about because in those days spaceflight was not generally regarded as a realistic objective, and that was a bit pie in the sky. So although we were working toward that end, it was not something we acknowledged much publicly. Not necessarily for fear of ridicule, but probably somewhat.
With Sputnik and the whole, did you recall where you were or anything you heard about that when you realized?
The Society of Experimental Test Pilot was holding a symposium in the Beverly Hilton Hotel in October of '57, and I was working on. I think I may have been program chairman, but I'm not sure about that now. But for the symposium, but in any case, I was very much involved in the symposium, and we were trying to find ways to get the Los Angeles press interested in the kinds of technical presentations that were being produced there, and get a little coverage of what our industry was doing and what was happening in the test flight world. But that was a very hard sell, and it became completely impossible when Sputnik came across the sky, and all of a sudden we couldn't get any people to come listen to problems about airplane flying.
In your own reaction to Sputnik? Curiosity, or more than that, or God Almighty, or what?
I don't remember exactly what my reactions were at the time. Too much colored by intervening events. But I guess it was disappointing that a country who was the evil empire in our minds at that time would be beating us in technology where we thought we were preeminent. At the same time, it was encouraging because it demonstrated the kinds of things that we were interested in really might be achievable, and perhaps it would encourage people to look at our world with somewhat more curiosity and perhaps approval than they had before. It did change our world. It absolutely changed our country's view of what was happening and the potential of space. I'm not sure how many people realized at that point just where this would lead. And President Eisenhower, I think, was saying something like, well, what's the worry? It's just one small ball. But I'm sure he had that was a facade, behind which he had substantial concerns, because if they could put something into orbit, they could put a nuclear weapon on a target in the United States, because the navigation requirements were quite similar.
Something you said a minute or two ago reminded me of all of the how did the Russians get the bomb? And they must have stolen our secrets. They couldn't possibly have done this on their own, and they must have stolen our secrets, and they did in some part. But the real secret of the atomic bomb was revealed in August of 1945. That is, it works. And it seems to me that's almost what you're saying about Sputnik.
I mean,
It can be done.
Yeah, it can be done, and that was an eye-opener, I think, to a lot of people. And
To Killian.
immediately there was substantial interest in, well, maybe we can get people up into space.
Yeah.
That was instantaneous, that possibility.
Here you are a test pilot, and you're flying the most advanced aircraft in the world. What makes you at that point in time want to join the astronaut corps? What is it that made Neil Armstrong decide this is what I want to do?
Oh, it wasn't an easy decision. I was flying the X-15 and I had the understanding or belief that if I continued, I would be the chief pilot of that project. I was also working on the Dinosaur, and that was still a paper airplane, but was a possibility. And then there was this other project down at Houston, the Apollo program. Gemini hadn't been really much identified yet at that point, and wasn't clear to me which of those paths had gone. To recognize that people who are in this world see projects come and go. This project established, begun, it may run for several years, finally get canceled, and I had been assigned to aircraft test projects and never flew the airplane because the need changed or something else became more important, and I never got to that goal. And we sort of saw every project of this type as something that, well, it may go or it may not. And although you learn a lot when you're on a program that eventually gets canceled, there's a lot more satisfaction in being on a program that really reaches its fruition. And I can't tell you now just why, in the end, I made the decision I did, but I consider it as fortuitous that I happened to pick one that was a winning horse. But there would be no way to predict that at the time you got to that fork in the road. And in my case, a three-way fork.
When some of the other test pilots that didn't go into the Apollo program at St. Edwards that believed we're flying our own planes and had that attitude, did you ever catch space that's for, like the dog that went for the monkeys? Is that kind of an attitude that prevailed?
On the part of some, yeah. And at the time the Mercury program was started, it might well have gone that way. In a sense, it did, in that they had a lot of monkey flights and so on, flights. But I believe that the reason it did not keep that characterization was that the Mercury crewmen insisted on making it an airplane-like device, have the same conventions as normal airplanes so that your natural instincts were proper, and insist that the crewmen be able to perceive enough and see enough and have sufficient information available to him that he could make reasonable choices about proper alternatives and control the craft in a manner that would maximize the ability to get toward the objective. So I think that was a great contribution on the part of the Mercury guys who were probably abrasive to some of the engineering managers in that time and in their demands that the craft to be built in this way. So that certainly was important.
Did you have any encounters with Chuck Yeager during this period at all?
Oh, I've known Chuck for 40-some years. Yeah.
Was he? I'm just curious about. Was he somebody that other pilots looked up to as this extraordinary pilot, or is he just another one of the guys?
Oh, I think people recognized that he was a good pilot, stick and rudder man.
He's become almost a mythological pilot. I mean, his legend of Chuck Yeager's become. You think that's just through books and media and things like that?
Not best.
What was the astronaut selection process like, and what kinds of physical and psychological tests were you subjected to once you made that decision on your part?
Well, I don't think the community of flight medicine and flight physiology knew very much what they needed to do at that point. There were widespread predictions that humans could not survive in space for a variety of reasons, both physical, physiological, and mental, and psychological, all kinds of reasons. So they didn't really know exactly what to test for, I think. So they did everything. They didn't miss anything, as far as I know. They did every test known to man. Not necessarily fun. Survivable.
And you obviously passed all those with flying colors.
I don't know what the results were.
What was your first experience, and suddenly you're now in the astronaut ranks? What became your impressions of the Space Task Group, and how did that differ from being out in California?
Well, a lot of the people in the Space Task Group I'd known for some years because they mostly came from Langley, although some actually came from Edwards. Some came from Ames, but predominantly Langley. And I had known them in my work at Edwards because they were very much involved in the analytical and wind tunnel work that supported the kind of work that we were doing. So Bob Gilruth was a wonderful man who was a superb handling qualities expert. Probably one of the best in the world, and I knew Chris Kraft and Max Faget, and remember the discussions earlier that we'd had at conferences on these subjects of blunt shapes and flying bodies and winged vehicles and so on, and which were the best configurations and what were the pluses and minuses of different routes to go into space. So I came in with the high confidence level that those were people who I could respect and knew had the background and the inclination and the determination to do what would lie ahead.
How did your job as an astronaut differ from being a test pilot? What were the first things you started realizing that would be different for you?
Well, it was very different. There were some similarities in the sense that we were planning and we were trying to solve problems and devise approaches, but since we were trying to do an operational job, we were extremely focused. A research project tends to be more broad, generic, cover a range so that you have indications as to which might be the best path. In the Apollo and Gemini programs, Mercury, I really wasn't involved in the early parts of that, but in the germination of Gemini and Apollo, we were looking for not a range of stuff, but the best method that we could find that would give us the ability to go at the earliest possible time, maximum speed, and with the highest level of confidence. Quite a different responsibility. Yet the skills, the engineering approaches, and the equipment available to us was really quite similar.
These things, training and simulation, which are all part of getting ready for a successful space flight. How do you help determine what should be simulated and how? And in retrospect, how realistic were these training sessions and simulations from what you ended up encountering?
I think training was about 1/3 of our time and effort. A third had to do with planning, figuring out the techniques and methods that would allow us to achieve the trajectories and the sequence of events and the ways of picking from the available strategies the one that might work the best. And the last part was testing, and that's probably equal to but a lot, thousands of hours in the labs and in the spacecraft and running systems tests, all kinds of stuff, seeing whether it would work and getting to know the systems very well. So the 1/3 that was training is training in a different sense than most people think of training, because after all, there wasn't anybody that had done this and that could tell us how to do it, because nobody's had the experience. But they could tell us what they did know, and some became systems experts, and they would know the details of how the inertial guidance system or the computer or certain kind of engine valves and so on would operate, and how we might handle malfunctions and those. So we spent enormous amounts of time gleaning everything we could from the people who are experts in these particular smaller components of the spacecraft or the launch vehicle. We also spent a lot of time in simulations, and simulators have gotten better over the years at a prodigious rate. In my days at Edwards, we did a lot of simulations of flight characteristics and aircraft trajectories and things of that sort. We did them all with analog computers because digital computers were just far too slow to use for simulations. At about the time of the early 60s, digital computers were getting faster, and they were much more precise. Slow, but very precise. So then we started marrying analog and digital computers, and used the digital to do the precise calculations, and used the analog part to do the actual aircraft response things, which had to be a lot faster. And then by the middle of the 60s, computers were getting to be fast enough that you could actually do simulations of aircraft flight motions with them. So because I worked a lot in simulators as collateral duty while I was here at Houston, I spent a lot of time evaluating the authenticity and appropriateness of the simulation models that they were using. And you could usually find that the simulator didn't behave properly like it should in some regions of flight, so it was incumbent on us to uncover the problems that simulation have, try to make it as accurate as we could. Now, there's some danger in that because you might not be right about your conclusions about the appropriateness of the simulation. But that was an important part of our function, and certainly the astronauts' crews weren't the only people doing that. Test pilots at at Grumman and at North American and McDonnell, and also were doing similar kinds of things that contribute to that. And the result was that by the time in the late 60s, our computer simulations were really quite excellent, and they were quite adequate to do most all the things that we were doing. There's an old perception that simulators are always more difficult to fly than the craft themselves, and in general that is true, and it certainly turned out to be true in Apollo, particularly the lunar module, which was to our benefit, that it was easier to fly than the simulator, because expecting something that was somewhat more cantankerous, contrary, than it actually turned out to be.
Did you stay involved with operations and training even after you became a backup commander in Gemini 5?
To a lesser extent, because once you get on a flight crew, a very large percentage of your time is committed, and so at that point in time, and before we had many new guys coming in, we had a bit of a gap in my perspective. Too many people were they were gladly assigned to flight crews, but it left some openings behind us, and some things weren't covered to the degree we would have liked them to have been.
How did you feel when President Kennedy made his great challenge to put a man on the moon to that speech? Not just yourself, but the whole team you're with. Was that a moment where you really, can you recall Kennedy's speech, and can you recall that kind of commitment that came out of President Kennedy?
Yes, I certainly remember it, but it's a bit hazy because I've heard the recordings of it so many times since that you don't remember. You're not certain whether you're remembering or you're remembering what you're remembering. So I'm not certain what it was, and of course it's been colored by the fact that I've read so many stories of how that process actually occurred and what led to his conclusion to do that. And I guess I've been persuaded by historians that it wouldn't have been his first choice, but he didn't find any other good options to go against the Soviets with. And the world was caught up in what the Soviets were doing, and he felt it. And he campaigned against Lyndon on the basis that we were behind in rocketry and Nixon.
Against Nixon too, of course.
So
against Eisenhower, really.
Yeah, it was against them.
I guess I'm thinking of this youngness of all of you, and here's this young president saying that. Was it a kind of, you felt like he was part of the team, like he was a leader now? With President Kennedy, we really had a leader that wanted to put the space program on the forefront of the American agenda?
Our concern always was, what will the Congress do? Because, the president can proclaim, but it's the Congress that makes things happen. And so that's really where the question was: how are they going to? Well, as it turned out, they were motivated to support the president in this area, which I'm not sure I necessarily would have guessed at that point, based on.
Let me go back for a second to the event that got the president to say we're going to get to the moon. You were a combat pilot in the Korean War. That was only a decade earlier, and you were at the very cutting edge of test pilot and working on all the things that you were working on at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Did you guys pay much attention to that? Was there much feeling of, God Almighty, we ought to be in on this?
There was, because, and you remember at the time, it was a time of such incredibly high tension nationally, and and internationally, and we were, I think everyone felt we were right on the brink of potential World War III. And I don't think anybody, even the people in the backwoods of Montana, were aware of this heightened sense of tension. I was very aware of it, and I thought that could shove aside all the work we're doing in favor of other things that the country decided were more important from a strategic point of view.
And what about you and the people you were working with? Did you feel like, God, what are we doing this for? Because we need to be a part of if there's going to be World War III, we want to be a part of it. And what we're aiming at right now, what we're trying to do is like yesterday's newspaper.
Exactly. That was a concern, but at the time, I think, the reality was you got your job to do, and you just go ahead and do it, and keep doing it. Hope for the best.
Yeah. As in the events of last Tuesday.
Yeah. Just carry on.
Yeah.
Where were you when Alan Shepard made his famous flight?
I don't know. I was at Edwards at the time, but I can't remember where specifically I was at the...
And the same question with John Glenn, do you remember?
Yeah, I was at home at the time, I remember.
Watching it on the television news and reading about it.
Right. It was very early in the morning. I was in California, as I remember. I think it was dark.
Okay, do you recall when it was you were assigned to the Gemini 5 mission? And what were your thoughts at that time? And how was training for a mission different than your general training? Like, how did your life change when you suddenly were assigned to the mission?
Well, I was really pleased to be assigned to a flight, and quite satisfied to be in that position of backing up Gordon Cooper. It was quite a change from the time before, when we were working on lots of general projects and trying to build pieces here and there, to all of a sudden having a pretty much complete focus on achieving the objectives of that flight, which was originally intended to be a 1 week long flight, the first long duration flight. And there were a lot of other parts besides just long duration, but that was the principal objective. And Elliot C. was my associate on the backup crew. Conrad was flying the right seat in that flight. We were a very close team. We spent almost all our time together for months on end getting ready for that flight, both going back and forth between Houston, and spent a lot of time at the plant in St. Louis working with the spacecraft as it was nearing completion and participating in the testing of that spacecraft. So we all knew it very well by the time it was shipped to the Cape.
When you say spent almost all our time, your meals too?
Yeah, we ate together. Not when we were in St. Louis. We certainly were at home. We'd get home sometimes, but the reality of the world in those days is that a lot of the testing took place at 2 o'clock in the morning or 4:30 in the morning, and we were spelling each other off, and we would spend enormous amounts of time together working out the details.
And this was single-minded. You weren't bullshitting about the latest play that you saw, or
Oh, no.
the latest novel you had read.
No, I would not say that we never cracked a joke or talked about something off the project, but, we were 98% focused on what the job we had to do. And I was, and my perception of my colleagues was the same.
It is part of the popular perception, I guess, and it appears in some of the literature that the other astronauts have put out, that there was a lot of jockeying for position, and a lot of tension about who's going to get on this mission or that mission, who's going to be back, etc. Your reputation is the exact opposite of that. And I would like to hear you speak about that.
Well, I was so pleased to be associated with the program because it was going, it was happening, it was exciting. The goals I thought were important to not just the United States but to society in general, and I would have been happy doing anything they told me to do. And it's probably true that I was less inclined to be concerned about just what job I had than some were. And I think they're all different people. They all have different kinds of views on that subject. It wasn't as obvious to me as some of the stories I've read had portrayed it. I was, I looked forward to an actual flight assignment as much as anyone, as opposed to being the backup role. But the backup role I thought was an important job, and it just might turn out that we had to be ready, and we were going to be ready. And as you know, in some flights it did turn out that the backup crews or members of them had to step in.
During the mission, how closely were you involved with evaluating various problems like fuel cell problems or the thruster or excess water production? And what were your duties in assisting evaluation for, say, fuel cell bombs? Did you have a specialty? Did you really, knew more than some of the others? Or
I was not a fuel cell expert. We were at the Cape. Elliott C. and myself came back immediately after launch, and actually talked to the spacecraft when it went overhead at the end of first orbit from our T-38 on VHF, and came back and landed. Immediately went to mission control and made ourselves available to help with the flight. So we were both involved throughout that entire flight, and I can't certainly, all the various problems that they bumped into on that flight were very much involved, but I can't recall any specific aspects of it.
What were then the different requirements for the commander as opposed to a pilot on these missions? What made the commander, what different responsibilities did the commander have?
Well, we tried to divide the responsibilities such that each crew person was about equally loaded. They had we tried for each person to be able to know how to do everything if they had to, but we divided the responsibilities such that each would go into their area in enormous amount more depth, so they could, and that worked pretty well. I don't think it was practical or maybe even possible for both crewmen to know everything in the same degree of depth on every subject. So it was a shared responsibility situation. The commander, I guess, principally differs because he has the responsibility for the decisions, just as the commander of a ship or commander of an airliner or anything.
If necessary, the commander can override.
Yeah, he's always responsible for his craft. It was probably a more concern as to when there were differences of opinion would be the differences of opinion between those in flight and those in mission control. But I think we worked that out pretty well. We have great respect from the guys down there, guys and gals in mission control. But
I was going to ask you that the relations between mission controllers and the astronaut corps, he was characterized during this period. I guess you kind of did. It's pretty good. You felt that the respect for each of the other's jobs was where the tensions flare. We're just hey, you don't realize what we're dealing with, guys.
yeah, sometimes it did. We were fortunate that on the flights I was involved in, I don't think we had any problems of any significant magnitude in that category. Generally, the people in flight and people in mission control were on the same frequency most of the time.
There was not a we and them.
No, it's we and we.
Can you describe a little bit your training for the Gemini 8 mission? And any of the nature, anything, how was that different from some of your other training?
Well, since I'd already been through one cycle with Gemini 5, I knew generally the content of the preparation. The differences were those things that would be different between the flights. We were going to have a rendezvous, which Gemini 5 did not have. We're going to have a extravehicular backpack in the back. We had experiments that were different than the experiments on Gemini 5. So we probably concentrated somewhat more on the things that were different, but we still did practice the rendezvous and practice the launches and practice the entry steering and all those kinds of things. You had to sort of fill the squares and make sure you had done enough of those that you felt confident in your ability, and the people that were watching you on the ground and kind of grading how you did also felt confident that you were in control of your destiny.
How well did you know Dave Scott at the time of Gemini 8?
I had not known Dave well at all at Edwards, so I only got to know him when he came to Houston. But I liked working with Dave. He was very good at what he did. He was diligent and he was hardworking, and I felt confident in his ability to handle his part of the responsibilities.
And then the backup crews, Conrad and Gordon. I was wondering I've never quite understood this. How does NASA decide who's going to be assigned which position or which mission? They would it wasn't for that particular mission. They thought one of you had a better skill. It was just to rotate you all and give you equal experience.
Well, Deke Slayton was responsible for assigning the crews, and I don't know what technique he used to do that. He gave me the assignment of determining how many crews were needed throughout the entire Gemini program, how many people were needed, with assignments for primary and backup or alternate flight crews, and some people off and some people on vacation, some people sick, and so I built a schedule for him of my perspective on what was required, and it's my belief that that he used that kind of a schematic to determine when additional crews needed to be brought into the program, and he used that kind of thing in assignment, because in assigning individuals to crews, because you couldn't just take one person and decide where he's going to be without knowing what he would be doing next or before, and how that interfered with or interconnected with other crew assignments. And it was quite a complex job, and we actually had so few people that almost everybody was assigned all the time. In that period, I would come off one crew assignment, and within a few weeks I'd be assigned to something else, and that endured throughout the entire Gemini program.
With the Gemini 8 mission, how concerned were you with the success of the docking maneuvers? And with, considering it was really NASA's first attempt.
We had a docking simulator which was quite accurate. We felt it was a good representation of what we could expect, and indeed it turned out to be quite similar to what we encountered in flight. I really believed that we wouldn't have any trouble with the docking based on the simulations we did, and indeed that turned out to be the truth.
What was going to your mind, however, when your aircraft started to spin at that moment? I mean, was that one of the, you've had a lot of close calls from Korea to Edwards. I guess, how do you maintain your cool under such harrowing conditions?
We first suspected that the Agena was the culprit. We had shut our own control system off, and we were on the dark side of the Earth, so we really didn't have any outside reference, or a very good reference, and I didn't actually notice when it started to deviate from the planned attitude. Dave first noticed it. Neither of us thought the Gemini might be the culprit, because you could easily hear the Gemini thrusters whenever they fired. They were out right in the nose, in front of me, some in the back. Every time one fired, it was just like a pop gun. Crack, 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 crack. And we weren't hearing anything, so we didn't think it was our spacecraft. So Dave, who was running the Agena, he had the control panel for the Agena on his side. It was a docking adapter and a electrical connection there that allowed Dave to send controls to the Agena control system. And so he was trying everything he knew without success. When the rates became quite violent, I concluded that we couldn't continue, that we had to get ourselves separate. I was afraid we might lose consciousness because our spin rate had gotten pretty high, and I wanted to make sure that we got away before that happened. And of course, once we got away and found out we turned our thrusters back on and couldn't regain control in a normal manner, we recognized that it was a failure in our craft, not the Agena. And the reason we didn't hear it is you don't hear it when it's running. You only hear it when it fires. You don't hear it when it's running steadily. I didn't really know that at the time, but figured it out.
Okay, so were concerned with colliding with the Agena after undocking?
Sure, we were, because we didn't know exactly what our relative trajectories would be, because at the time we disengaged, we weren't in steady flight. If you're in steady flight, you can disengage and kind of predict what the relative paths will be, but when you're tumbling, that's not predictable, so it was a bit dicey. That was a great disappointment to us, to have to cut that flight short. we had so many things we wanted to do, and some of them, I know Dave wanted to do an EVA and try out the backpack and do all that kind of stuff, and it was very disappointing to have to call it quits, come home.
You made a decision, and you got back to Earth.
Yep.
I spend a lot of my life talking to men who have made big decisions. And in this case, your life and others were at stake. And sometimes it could be a whole battalion, and sometimes a squad, or sometimes the crew of a ship, or whatever. What I get more often than anything else is, what were you thinking? How did you come to this conclusion? Or, God, that was really gutsy of you to have done that, or so on, I'll say. Almost always, they'll say, that's where the training comes in. And you just follow your training. And this situation demanded that I do that. And I had learned that in training, and so I did it. Now, I'm not putting any words into your mouth, and I'm not putting those into your mouth, but in your case, it's certainly something you've thought about since. What do you attribute that decision and the action that you took to?
Well, I can't make too much of it. I think generally you try to keep going as long as you safely can and try to save the flight, the objectives, and try to put everything back together. And at some point you just have to make a decision that I can't take the risk of pursuing my goal further, because I have to go back to the foundation instincts, which is save your craft, save the folks, get back home, and be disappointed that you had to leave some of your goals behind. But
what was the reaction of mission control when you re-entered communications with them? Were they quickly able to adapt to the situation?
Well, we didn't have much communication with mission control. You see, Murphy's Law says bad things always happen at the worst possible time. And in this case, we were in orbit that did not go over stations that were in contact with we didn't go over any station. We were sort of out of radio contact most of the time. And when we were, it was over the Rosenot Victor or the Coastal Sentry Quebec, the ships that were at sea who had limited ability to communicate back with mission control and transmit data to them. So our communication was just with the people on those ships. And they were trying as best they could to be helpful and identify things, but it was a real challenge for them because there wasn't much to be gained. They could see that we had a problem, but as far as deciphering that problem, I think they were in general as much mystified as we were.
When you started heading back towards Earth, did you start worrying about now you're going to have to land in some remote location? You have to have a splashdown, or how are we going to be found? I would think I'd almost be more terrified with being splashing down into the ocean and being unfound in a capsule there that might have a leak or something. And then we're all, or you just keep trying to go forward.
Being an old Navy guy, I much preferred coming down in the water to coming down in Red China at the time.
Found you. Okay. But was there a lot of lag time between your rescue being picked up?
We heard the sound of the propeller airplane, I think it was DC-4, as we were coming down in the chute, and we assumed it was friendly.
I guess what I'm getting at is I'm just trying to put the normal, or the impossible to do, but in these moments like on an X-15 when you're not sure you're going to be able to land. I guess the skills of astronauts is that ability to respond without panic in the most unbelievable situations imaginable. The thought that at any minute you might be unconscious in space, and that's happening. At the same time, you're seeing the spectacular scenery. I can't even imagine seeing Earth for the first time. It seems to, what a rush of adrenaline and emotion, and yet with all that happening, it seems that the astronauts, by and large, kept things in check. Is that a testimony to the training, or the intelligence of NASA to find the right men who had, to use the cliche, the right stuff?
I think it predominantly is experience over training. Training certainly helps, but having been in flying machines for many years and faced a lot of difficulty and become accustomed to being required to solve problems as they arise is expected of pilots, and particularly test pilots who get a higher percentage of things going wrong than normal pilots. I think that's, and I'm not saying that we did it perfectly in every case, but I'm sure we didn't. But the experience that we'd had in flying a variety of different kind of machines in difficult circumstances certainly enhances your ability to look at a situation and analyze it and determine what your probable best course is and how much latitude you have to deviate from that best course. It's not an easy subject to describe adequately, but it seems to have worked.
That's a quite wonderful answer. And it's gotten me to think. The men of World War II with whom I interviewed, almost none of them, and not even the regular Army officers, nobody had ever been in anything like World War II before it came about. And they had to rely on their training. But you had experience. And you did as you just said. So, and if you're leading a squad forward into an attack on a terrain that is different from the other, there's no experience you can draw on that. It's got to be training. Mm-hmm. But in your case, that's just quite a wonderful answer. And you also got me thinking of, you're afraid you're going to pass out and you're cartwheeling around in space and all the rest. It made me think about that guy last Tuesday on that plane that crashed that he sent down in Pennsylvania. Yeah. And he just made this decision, screw this, I'm going to die anyway. Yeah. I think and now I'm going to act on that basis.
Yeah, it's, there are a lot of scenarios you could point about, you could conjure about that, but one of them is right. I mean, because they did decide to try to regain control of the aircraft, and there was some kind of a battle between the people on board, and it didn't end up the way they wanted, but could have ended up worse.
Those were real heroes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Is it all this training, as exciting as it is to hear your career, there's a lot of sacrifice you're making constantly. You're living in far from the desert in California, and then Houston as it's just starting to really grow and work, have difficulty.
Some people would think it's a sacrifice to live in Houston.
Yeah, I guess I'm raising children at different hours.
Just in August, though.
Well, I would think anything's worth it just to see Earth. I mean, just to see Earth from that perspective for a pilot that you got must have been something that so awesome.
It's a bit. You can understand it. You can see these pictures and kind of get an idea. But you can take a picture of the Grand Canyon too, and it's not the same as standing on the rim and looking down there. And I think it's the same here. A picture does a great job, but it's not nearly like being there.
God, I can't imagine. And it was, in part of your mind is, I guess at that moment, does that kind of calm come over you when you see Earth like that? I mean, is it almost a religious experience?
Yeah, I don't know how to answer that. It probably affects different people in different ways. It is spectacular, and I think everyone is touched by it when they have the experience. But I don't know what goes on in other people's minds.
Former astronaut Neil Armstrong, and an interview conducted by Stephen Ambrose and Douglas Brinkley on September 19, 2001. It was recorded at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, as part of JSC's Oral History Project. The interview was edited for this broadcast.